Part 4. Actium and the Final Defiance. C. 3130 BCE. Chapter 10. The die is cast at Actium. Dawn broke over the Ionian Sea on September 2nd, painting the waters off Actium in unsettlingly tranquil stripes of pink and gold. A deceptive calm, for beneath that beautiful horizon lay our fateful enemy, arrayed in disciplined lines. I stood on the high forecastle deck of my flagship, the Antonia, clad in gleaming gilt-scale armor, the royal Uraeus serpent cresting my helmet. The salt wind tugged at loose strands of my hair, cool against my skin, and I tasted the metallic tang of brine and apprehension on my lips. In the middle distance, like a dark, ominous stain spreading across the water, Octavian's fleet waited, compact and menacing. After months of agonizing stalemate, the moment of brutal decision had finally arrived. Around me, our own massive war galleys, the pride of Egypt and Antony's eastern fleet, creaked and groaned as oars were shipped, poised for the signal. These were enormous vessels, towering Octeris and Decorus, built for close-quarters crushing power, bristling with catapults and marines. Antony had concentrated many of our heaviest hitters near my flagship, forming a formidable, if somewhat unwieldy, centerpiece. Further out, circling like patient sharks, Agrippa's lighter, swifter Roman Liburnian galleys darted menacingly, ready to exploit any gap, their agility a stark contrast to our deliberate might. The fundamental difference in naval philosophy was stark. I prayed our planned overwhelming force would prevail over their famed maneuverability. From the command tower of his adjacent flagship, Antony conferred briefly with his admirals one last time. Our eyes met across the intervening water, a shared glance of grim resolve. Little remained to be said that our hearts and minds had not already grappled with during the preceding tense weeks. Nearby, I could see Caesarion, barely a man yet determined to show the courage worthy of his claimed father, standing rigidly near Antony's side, his small frame swallowed by scaled armor. Fear, cold and sharp, tightened my chest at the thought of him caught in the terrifying violence to come. Yet a fierce pride swelled too, he had insisted, viewing this battle as a matter of honor, a necessary test of his lineage. With a strident, echoing blare of Roman bucinae and Egyptian trumpets, punctuated by the thunderous roar of thousands of oars churning the sea, the battle commenced. Our great galleys lumbered forward in a broad crescent formation, aiming to break through Octavian's center. Almost immediately, however, Agrippa's tactical genius became apparent. His lighter wings refused to engage directly, instead curling rapidly around our flanks, threatening to envelop us, attempting to sever our connection to the open sea behind. If they succeeded, we would be trapped against the coast, hemmed in, vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. The vastness of the sea suddenly felt like a closing trap. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of pitch and burning wood, the desperate shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men, the splintering crash of timber as rams found their mark. Smoke from flaming missiles and grappling hooks stung my eyes, obscuring the larger picture, reducing the grand battle to chaotic, terrifying vignettes. From our signal posts, increasingly frantic messages arrived via semaphore flags, allied squadrons on the wings faltering under Agrippa's pressure, ships becoming isolated and overwhelmed, fires spreading uncontrollably from vessel to vessel. It rapidly became terrifyingly clear that the battle was turning against us far faster than anticipated. Our heavier ships struggled to maneuver in the confused melee, becoming targets for the nimbler Roman craft darting in to attack vulnerable points. My stomach turned to ice water. Every instinct, honed by years of assessing precarious situations, screamed that we were not just losing, we were on the verge of a catastrophic, inescapable rout. Clinging stubbornly to the fight now meant annihilation. If anything was to be salvaged our lives, a remnant of the fleet, the core of our cause, a decision had to be made now. There was no time for consultation, no possibility of coordinating a complex maneuver across the entire chaotic battlefront. Acting on instinct honed by command, I made the agonizing choice. I ordered my chief signal officer to sound the prearranged signal. For withdrawal, a distinct series of piercing trumpet blasts intended to cut through the din. Simultaneously, I commanded my massed crews to unfurl the great purple sails of the flagship, the unmistakable visual cue for disengagement, agreed upon for just such a dire contingency. The massive sheets dropped, catching the steady northward breeze, and the Antonia began to pull away from the swirling chaos. Seeing my sails fill and recognizing the trumpet signal, the captains of my immediate Egyptian squadron, loyal and well-drilled, swiftly followed suit, extricating their vessels from the fight and turning southward, oars digging deep, towards the relative safety of the open sea. Antony, embroiled in heavy fighting near the embattled center of our line, reportedly did not immediately see or perhaps register the signal amidst the deafening roar and confusion of his own engagement. But word quickly reached him perhaps via a frantic messenger boat, or perhaps he caught the shocking sight of my unmistakable Tyrian purple sails suddenly billowing where they should not be, moving away from the battle, in what witnesses later described as an impulsive, almost instinctive reaction. Antony broke off his attack, shouting orders for his own flagship to disengage and follow my receding sails. His personal guard squadron, loyal to him above all else, wheeled after him without question. To this day, historians debate, and I myself cannot be certain precisely what blend of thoughts raced through his mind in that desperate moment. Was it a calculated strategic assessment that the battle was irretrievably lost? Was it simply the ingrained instinct of a commander to follow a major contingent pulling out? Or was it, perhaps, the more personal, visceral impulse not to let me, Cleopatra, face whatever peril lay ahead alone, a fear of losing me overriding tactical considerations? Perhaps all those factors warred within him, but seeing both my Egyptian squadron and Antony's command group pulling away decisively, many other captains throughout the fleet interpreted it as an order for a general retreat. Those ships that could disentangle themselves from the melee joined our flight southward. The rest, trapped, surrounded, their command structure dissolving in confusion, fought on despairingly until they were inevitably destroyed, captured, or forced to surrender by Agrippa's triumphant fleet. As my ship surged southward, propelled by the favorable wind, away from the nightmare unfolding behind us, I stood gripping the stern rail, watching the horrific tableau recede. Acrid black smoke coiled towards the heavens from numerous burning wrecks, stark funeral pyres against the bright afternoon sky. The sea itself was littered with shattered timber, broken oars, and the pathetic sight of tiny figures desperately clinging to floating debris, their faint cries lost in the vastness. My fingernails bit deep into the polished wood of the rail, and hot tears of anguish, shame, and fury blurred my vision. We had lost. Utterly, decisively, catastrophically. I had made the brutal choice to salvage what little could be saved our lives. A core group of ships, perhaps the slimmest chance of regrouping, but it felt like the crushing weight of the entire disaster had settled directly onto my soul. In that awful, churning moment of retreat, I truly believed I might have doomed not just Antony's ambitions, but perhaps the very future of independent Egypt itself. Was I a queen saving her people, or a curse bringing ruin? Antony's flagship, faster and less damaged than some, caught up to mine by late afternoon as the wind carried us steadily southward, away from the scene of defeat. We dared not slow our pace. Pursuit by Octavian's victorious fleet remained a terrifying possibility, though, strangely, they did not press the chase with the expected relentless vigor, I learned later. Octavian chose to consolidate his victory and deal with the surrendered forces rather than risk his fleet in a potentially lengthy pursuit. A small boat transferred Antony across the choppy waves to my vessel. He came aboard, his magnificent armor dented and smeared with soot and blood, his handsome face a tight mask of utter despair and barely contained fury. Striding directly towards me where I stood waiting near the mainmast, he ignored any formalities. his voice raw and hoarse with disbelief and accusation. "Why, Cleopatra? By all the gods, why did you signal the retreat? We were holding. We could have won yet." His words struck me like a physical blow, sharp and unjust in their implication of cowardice. A tremor of conflicting emotions coursed through me, bone-deep exhaustion, overwhelming relief that he was alive and safe beside me, burning indignation at his immediate blame, and beneath it all, a vast shared grief for the monumental scale of our loss. My own voice, when I finally found it, emerged more brittle, more defensive than I intended. "One, open your eyes, Mark Antony. Look behind us. We were being enveloped. Our flanks were crumbling. Our allies were deserting. Would you have preferred we remain to burn and drown with the rest? Is that the victory you sought annihilation?" He stared at me, his eyes wide, stricken, as if I had struck him. For a dreadful heartbeat, I feared he might truly believe the venomous Roman propaganda, might genuinely see me as the treacherous foreign siren who had engineered his dishonor. But then, the fierce tension in his broad shoulders abruptly sagged. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound, crushing wave of sorrow and defeat. He understood the grim tactical reality, his commander's mind registering the truth behind my harsh words. Accepting such a colossal, public, world-altering defeat, however, was another matter entirely. He turned away sharply, unable to meet my gaze, ripping off his plumed helmet with a savage gesture and hurling it violently against the sturdy wooden mast with a resonant clang. I watched him in silence, allowing his rage and grief to wash over him. He cursed the gods, cursed Octavian's luck, cursed the false-hearted cowards among his allies who had faltered or fled, and cursed, finally, his own strategic folly for allowing himself to be drawn into a naval battle against Agrippa rather than relying on the proven strength of his legions on land. When at last his storm of anger momentarily subsided, leaving him slumped against the rail, breathing heavily, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, I approached him cautiously and laid a gentle hand on his arm. His muscles flinched under my touch, but he did not pull away entirely. "We live, Antonius," I whispered, my voice now softer, heavy with shared sorrow. "We survive. And while we live, hope remains. All is not yet lost." But he remained staring out at the empty horizon, refusing to meet my eyes, shame and heartbreak engulfing him like a shroud. He eventually mumbled something incoherent and wrenched away, retreating into a numb, sullen withdrawal, a profound silence that would shadow him for many agonizing days to come. Our voyage back towards Egypt was unspeakably grim. We sailed with only 60 warships out of the magnificent fleet that had sailed from Alexandria with such high hopes, the rest destroyed, sunk, or captured at Actium. The surviving crews were exhausted, many wounded, all deeply demoralized. Antony moved among them like a ghost, his customary charisma extinguished. At every port where we were forced to stop for essential water or meager provisions along the coasts of Greece and North Africa, the news echoed ahead of us, confirming the magnitude of the disaster. Actium was a shattering defeat for Antony. His remaining legions stationed in Greece were capitulating or deserting wholesale. Client kings and cities across the east, once fervent allies, were scrambling to send desperate embassies to Octavian, begging forgiveness and switching allegiance. It felt as though the entire Eastern world, seemingly solid in its support just months before, was dissolving around us like sandcastles washed away by the inexorable Roman tide. We were, in the eyes of the world, definitively, irrevocably, a lost cause. For Antony, each report of betrayal, each defection of a former comrade in arms, was like another twist of the dagger in his already bleeding pride. Some days, he could barely bring himself to emerge from his cabin. He spent long hours brooding alone, staring blankly at the waves, or drinking heavily, surrounded only by a few die-hard Roman companions, seeking solace in cups of strong wine that I often found abandoned, half-finished, scattered across the charts in his quarters. Once, discovering him in a state of near catatonic despair, I was horrified to find him pressing the sharp point of his own legionary sword against his belly, murmuring fatalistically that perhaps ending his misery now would spare everyone further suffering. I flew to his side, seizing the heavy sword away from him with surprising strength born of terror, shaking him fiercely back towards reality. "Do not dare abandon me now, Mark Antony!" I cried, my voice breaking with fear and fury, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "Do not leave me to face this catastrophe alone. If we suffer 100 defeats, we will still endure as long as breath remains in our bodies. Do you hear me? I will not surrender, and I will not lose you to despair or your own hand." He slumped against me then, nodding weakly, the immediate impulse momentarily broken by the sheer force of my desperation. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the creak of the ship's timbers. "You deserve better, Cleopatra. Better than this broken shell of a man." I held him tightly, allowing him my strength, both of us silent for a long moment, the salt of my tears and the salt of the sea air mingling on our faces. "We are not broken yet, Antonius," I insisted softly, pulling back just enough to meet his haunted gaze, willing him to see the resolve in my eyes. "Egypt remains. Our children remain. Caesarion, Alexander, Selene, Philadelphus. They are our future. For them, we must endure. For them, we must find a path forward, even through this devastation." He nodded numbly again, the mention of the children seeming to penetrate his deep despair for a brief instant, grounding him in his paternal love. Yet, the heavy cloak of profound melancholic depression did not truly lift during the remainder of that long, grim voyage back towards Alexandria. The vibrant, charismatic warrior whose laughter had once echoed through palaces, whose sheer animal vitality had seemed capable of conquering the world, was often now merely a shadow of his former self, pacing the decks restlessly at night, staring blankly for hours at the unchanging sea, or lost in prolonged periods of silent brooding, punctuated only by sudden, unpredictable bursts of impotent fury directed at fate, or by bouts of excessive drinking that dulled his pain but further clouded his judgment. I tried everything I could conceive to rouse him, to rekindle the fire within, appealing to his deep sense of Roman honor, reminding him of his past glorious victories, speaking passionately of our shared vision for an independent Eastern Empire ruled justly from Alexandria, invoking with desperate urgency the future of our beloved children. Sometimes, for fleeting moments, a spark of the old magnificent Antony would flicker in his eyes, but it rarely lasted. The deep wound inflicted at Actium, the wound of overwhelming defeat, of perceived betrayal by allies, soldiers, and perhaps even by the gods themselves, seemed to have struck too deep, poisoning his very spirit, shattering the core of his once indomitable self-belief. It was during these dark, turbulent days at sea, watching the slow, agonizing erosion of the great man beside me, that my own resolve hardened, transforming from shared grief into a colder, clearer focus, driven by sheer necessity. While my heart ached for Antony, for the passionate, flawed, magnificent man I had allied myself with, lived with, borne children with, the pragmatic queen of Egypt within me, the living vessel of Isis charged with preserving her realm, recognized the brutal strategic realities of our situation. Sentimentality was a luxury we could no longer afford. My paramount duty remained, as it always had been, the preservation of Egypt, the Ptolemaic throne, and the uncertain future of my children, especially Caesarion, the living link to the divine Julius Caesar, whose very existence might still, perhaps, offer some shred of leverage, some faint glimmer of hope in the darkness closing in. If Antony could not rally himself to lead effectively, then I would have to navigate the treacherous currents ahead largely on my own initiative, using whatever remaining resources, desperate alliances, or cunning strategies were available to me. I spent long hours conferring in hushed tones with my most loyal and capable attendants, the ever-faithful Charmian and Iris, my experienced treasurer Seleucus poring over maritime charts, assessing our remaining military strength, now almost entirely Egyptian forces, as Antony's non-Egyptian legions continued to melt away, meticulously calculating our critical grain reserves, drafting urgent, carefully worded diplomatic messages to any potential allies who might still dare to stand with us against the seemingly inevitable Roman tide, exploring even the most desperate contingency plans seeking refuge further east, perhaps in Arabia or even distant India, should Egypt itself fall entirely beyond saving. Hope dwindled with each passing nautical mile, a flickering candle against the rising gale of Roman victory, yet the primal instinct to survive, to rule, to protect my children and my legacy burned fiercely, implacably within me. Finally, after weeks at sea that felt like an eternity suspended between disaster and doom, the familiar low-lying coastline of the Nile Delta emerged hazily from the shimmering heat haze. We sailed slowly, almost shamefacedly, back into the great harbor of Alexandria. The towering Pharos lighthouse, my ancestors' enduring monument, still standing sentinel though damaged by past conflicts, seemed to welcome us home, not with pride, but with a somber, almost pitying gaze. The city itself felt unnaturally subdued, tense, palpably aware of the disaster that had befallen us long before our battered, diminished fleet reappeared on the horizon. There were no cheering crowds thronging the quays this time, only clusters of anxious faces watching in apprehensive silence, furtive whispers exchanged behind cupped hands, and the unusually watchful eyes of the augmented palace guard lining the docks. We had left Alexandria only months earlier with such bravado, such confidence, such pageantry, leading a magnificent combined fleet destined, we believed, to secure the mastery of the Eastern world. We returned defeated, disheartened, Antony a broken shadow of himself, bearing news of unimaginable catastrophe, with the inexorable legions of Octavian looming just beyond the horizon, threatening to engulf everything we held dear. Alexandria's last desperate stand was about to begin. Chapter 11. Alexandria's Last Stand. The months following our disastrous return to Alexandria in the late autumn of 31 BCE stretched into a suffocating winter, and then a tense, unnaturally hot spring and summer in 30 BCE. Time seemed both to crawl agonizingly slowly and race terrifyingly fast towards an inevitable conclusion. We lived under the ever-lengthening shadow of Octavian's impending arrival, a city holding its breath. The vibrant pulse of Alexandria, usually a symphony of trade, debate, and worship, felt muted, replaced by anxious whispers in the marketplaces, furtive glances towards the harbor, and the unsettling sight of increased military patrols along the Canopic Way. Within the palace, the air, once alive with the energy of our eastern ambitions, now hung heavy with unspoken fear and the grim reality of our isolation. Laughter felt like a distant memory, replaced by hushed strategic discussions and the heavy tread of guards. While Antony, my once indomitable Roman eagle, seemed lost in a labyrinth of despair, oscillating between bouts of forced, morbid revelry with his few remaining loyal Roman companions, their society grimly renamed the Synopotumenois, those dying together, and long periods of withdrawn silence fueled by too much wine, I could not afford the luxury of surrender. My grief for our shattered dreams, for the vibrant man seemingly fading before my eyes, ran deep, a constant ache beneath my ribs. But the duties of a pharaoh, the instincts of a mother, demanded action, not lamentation. Isis does not weep when her children are threatened. She finds strength, she plans, she endures. My focus became relentlessly twofold, bolstering Egypt's last defenses and desperately seeking any possible path to secure a future, however diminished, for my children. I dispatched trusted envoys on perilous journeys overland through the desert and by sea, dodging Roman patrols, carrying secret messages seeking aid or alliances from any quarter, still potentially willing to defy Rome, perhaps the Nabatean Arabs, perhaps distant kingdoms further east. Most probes met with polite, evasive refusals, or simply ominous silence. The world understood that the tide had turned decisively at Actium. Simultaneously, I oversaw the frantic reinforcement of Alexandria's formidable walls, oversaw the recruitment of fresh troops from the loyal heartlands of Upper Egypt and allied Nubia, supervised the hasty repair of what few seaworthy warships remained in our harbor after Actium's losses and subsequent defections, and meticulously managed the distribution of Egypt's vast grain reserves stored in the royal granaries. Maintaining the loyalty of the Alexandrian populace through continued sustenance was paramount. I knew well from history, including my own father's experience, that hunger breeds sedition far faster than any enemy propaganda. Within the increasingly tense confines of the palace, my relationship with Antony remained a complex tapestry woven with threads of lingering affection, shared memories, profound frustration, and political divergence. Moments of genuine tenderness still surfaced, brief flashes of the charismatic, passionate man I had loved, especially when our young children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, now spirited 6-year-olds, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, a toddler taking his first steps, were brought to see him. He adored them with a fierce paternal love, and their innocent presence, their laughter echoing briefly in the subdued halls, sometimes seemed to momentarily penetrate the thick fog of his brooding melancholy. Yet, politically, his judgment felt increasingly erratic, dangerously clouded by despair, and prone to swings between unrealistic hopes of phantom legions rising to his aid and fits of deep, immobilizing apathy. He clung to illusions, while I was forced to confront the chilling strategic reality. Octavian's advance was methodical, deliberate, relentless. His legions were methodically consolidating control over Syria and Palestine. His navy, under the brilliant Agrippa, commanded the seas utterly. A direct military confrontation against Rome's full might was now almost certainly hopeless. Our only slender, desperate chance, I calculated, lay in negotiation, in playing for time, perhaps in sacrificing Antony himself, a thought that brought a bitter taste to my mouth, if it meant saving the core kingdom of Egypt and the lives of my children, especially Caesarion. It was during this agonizing period that I took the calculated risk of sending secret, deniable emissaries to Octavian, probing for any potential terms. My communications were exquisitely careful, seeking guarantees for Egypt's status, inquiring about the future disposition of my children, perhaps subtly hinting between lines meant for a Roman mind to read that Antony's fate need not be linked to Egypt's, if Egypt's traditional autonomy under Roman friendship could somehow be preserved. Was it betrayal? In his darkest wine-fueled moods, Antony sometimes hurled that accusation at me, his voice raw with pain and suspicion, grasping my wrist tightly in a sudden flare of anguish. "Are you already bargaining with the butcher for my head, Cleopatra? Is that your final loyalty?" he once snarled, his eyes blazing with a desperate hurt that mirrored my own. I met his tortured gaze steadily, refusing to flinch, though his words pierced me. "I bargain for Egypt, Antonius," I replied, my voice low but firm with the weight of pharaonic responsibility. "I bargain for our children's lives. As queen, as mother, that is my sacred duty. Would you have me do less? Would you have me simply surrender everything, our kingdom, our children, our entire legacy to Octavian's whim without exploring every possible path, however distasteful or desperate?" He released my wrist then, turning away sharply, unable to meet my eyes. The terrible conflict between his Roman pride, his wounded love, and the unbearable reality of defeat raging unresolved within him. I knew my pragmatism might appear cold, ruthless even, but Isis, the wise protector, guides her realm through foresight and difficult choices, not merely through the heart's passions when survival itself is at stake. As the oppressive heat of the Egyptian summer reached its peak in July of 30 BCE, the final act began. Octavian's legions arrived, marching methodically along the coast road from the east, brushing aside the last vestiges of desperate resistance offered by Antony's dwindling forces near Pelusium. Soon, the disciplined Roman encampment spread ominously just outside the eastern walls of Alexandria itself, their eagle standards gleaming brazenly under the sun that had once shone only for pharaohs. The siege began in earnest. The city held its breath, trapped between defiance and despair. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew thick with frantic preparations and fading hope. Antony, roused from his torpor, perhaps by the imminent, tangible presence of the enemy, made one last valiant, characteristic flourish. He led a surprisingly successful cavalry sortie, charging out from the city gates against Octavian's advance guard, driving them back temporarily in a flash of his old brilliance, returning briefly, exhilarated, tasting again the familiar, addictive adrenaline of combat. That evening, we held a final, strained feast in the palace, attempting to celebrate this small victory with a forced, almost hysterical gaiety, even as the Roman siege engines outside creaked ominously through the night. But it was merely a fleeting reprieve, a candle guttering before the storm. The very next day brought utter collapse. Antony's remaining infantry forces, ordered to march out and engage the main Roman legions, reportedly hesitated, wavered, and then either deserted en masse or simply refused to fight effectively, melting away before the disciplined Roman advance. Simultaneously, the remnants of our Egyptian fleet still stationed within the harbor, under orders to challenge Octavian's ships enforcing the naval blockade, allegedly defected without striking a blow, their crews perhaps bribed or simply recognizing the futility of further resistance. This double betrayal by Roman legionaries and Egyptian sailors alike crushed Antony's spirit completely, irrevocably. Returning to the palace, consumed by a maelstrom of despair, rage, and perhaps paranoid suspicion that even my own diplomatic efforts had somehow undermined him, he lost control. Distraught, hearing a false rumor, perhaps deliberately spread by panicked servants, perhaps simply a tragic misunderstanding in the chaos, that I had already taken my own life within my fortified mausoleum, Antony resolved finally to die as a Roman should. He commanded his faithful attendant, Eros, to kill him. But Eros, devoted to his master, turned the sword upon himself instead, dying at Antony's feet. Shamed and perhaps inspired by this act of loyalty, Antony then attempted to fall upon his own sword. The thrust, however, perhaps clumsy in his anguish, inflicted a grievous, but not immediately fatal, wound. Agonized and bleeding heavily, learning that I was in fact still alive and secured within my nearby mausoleum, a sturdy structure built near the temple of Isis, already prepared as my final refuge or tomb, where I had retreated with my children and closest attendants as the city's defenses crumbled the dying, Antony begged his attendants to carry him to me for a final farewell. The scene that followed remains etched forever in my memory. A moment of supreme personal tragedy played out against the epic backdrop of collapsing empires. From an upper window of the heavily barred mausoleum, we dared not unseal the massive stone doors for fear of the rioting mobs or encroaching Roman soldiers. My devoted attendants Charmian and Iris, weeping silently, helped me lower strong linen ropes. With immense difficulty, agonizing slowness, we managed to hoist the limp, bleeding, semi-conscious form of Mark Antony up through the window and into the relative sanctuary of my presence. He lay upon the funerary couch I had prepared, ghastly pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, his powerful chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths, his magnificent physique, which had once seemed forged from bronze, now terribly vulnerable, stained crimson with his lifeblood. I knelt beside him immediately, cradling his heavy head in my lap, gently wiping the sweat and grime from his brow with trembling hands, tears streaming unchecked down my face, washing away the calculated composure of the queen, leaving only the raw grief of the woman. Gone in that moment was all political maneuvering, all strategic calculation, all thought of Rome or empire. I was simply holding the man I had shared kingdoms, ambitions, dreams, and children with. the man whose grand passions had mirrored my own, as his extraordinary life force painfully ebbed away. He managed with monumental effort to open his eyes. His gaze, clouded with pain, found mine, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even of peace, softening his features. He whispered my name, Cleopatra. His voice a threadbare rasp, barely audible. Even then, in his final moments, his thoughts turned practical. He urged me, his words faint, to seek terms with Octavian if possible, to try and secure my own life, trusting only Proculeius among Octavian's officers. Ironic advice, given Proculeius's later role in my capture. Then, true to his nature to the last, he asked for one final cup of wine. I held the golden goblet, steadying my own shaking hands, to his lips. He drank weakly, a final taste of life's sweetness. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to carry away the last of his mighty spirit, he lay back against the cushions, his eyes closing. His breathing grew shallower, fainter, until, with a final, almost peaceful exhalation, it ceased altogether. Mark Antony, Roman triumvir, master of the East, my ally, my lover, my husband in the eyes of Egypt, the flawed, magnificent, passionate father of my children, was dead in my arms. I wept then, long and hard, releasing the storm of grief I had held tightly suppressed for months, mourning not just the man, but the end of an era, the death of a dream. Assisted by my steadfast Charmian and Iris, their faces also wet with tears, I performed the solemn, traditional Egyptian rites of mourning over his still warm body. Anointing him with sacred oils, wrapping him carefully in strips of the finest white linen, honoring the fallen Roman general as if he were a departed pharaoh, the Osiris to my Isis. The world outside might remember him solely as a defeated traitor to Rome, but here, within the heart of my besieged kingdom, he would be mourned with the dignity befitting a king, the great consort of Egypt's queen. Yet, even as the tears flowed, even as my heart physically ached with the profound finality of his loss, a cold knot of pragmatic resolve began to form again deep within my core, the instinctive survival mechanism of a ruler who had navigated treacherous currents her entire life. Antony was gone. The city was falling. Sounds of fighting faded into an ominous quiet that suggested Roman control was consolidating. Octavian the victor stood effectively at my gates. My own fate, and more critically, the fate of my children, the legacy of my dynasty, the very memory of independent Egypt, now rested entirely upon my remaining wits, my courage, and whatever lingering power the name, the legend, of Cleopatra still commanded. The last act of this long, complex, and ultimately tragic drama was about to unfold. Chapter 12. Facing Octavian. The fall of Alexandria, once Antony drew his last breath, was swift, brutally efficient, almost anticlimactic. With organized resistance dissolving, and Antony's death becoming known, Octavian's disciplined legions marched into the city through gates opened perhaps by treachery, perhaps by resigned citizens hoping to avoid a sack. The sounds of conquest replaced the familiar city hum, sharp Latin commands echoing off limestone walls, the rhythmic, heavy tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals on paved streets, the unsettling silence falling over neighborhoods as residents shuttered themselves indoors. Roman eagle standards, symbols of implacable power, were soon planted firmly on the rooftops of key buildings, proclaiming a new, unwelcome mastery over my ancient capital. From within the silent, heavily fortified walls of my mausoleum, where I remained secluded with Antony's shrouded body, my few loyal attendants, and the heavy weight of imminent dread, I awaited the arrival of the victor. It was not long in coming. Gaius Proculeius, a trusted officer of Octavian, the very man Antony, in his final moments, had strangely advised me to trust, appeared at the massive stone doors, calling out, negotiating. Octavian had sent him, Proculeius claimed, to ensure my safety, to offer assurances of honorable treatment, appealing to my dignity as a queen, while implicitly demanding my surrender. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the very model of Roman civility barely concealing the iron fist. Wary, yet seeing little alternative to engagement, I spoke with him through a high barred window, deliberately drawing out the conversation, asking about terms, seeking guarantees for my children, attempting to gauge his sincerity while playing desperately for time to think, time perhaps for something else. But Octavian, or perhaps Proculeius himself, was shrewder than I calculated. While my attention was focused on the negotiation at the front, other Roman soldiers, guided perhaps by an overlooked architectural plan or sheer scaling audacity, used ladders to silently ascend the rear walls of the mausoleum. Suddenly, shockingly, the sound of shattering masonry erupted from above, and Romans dropped down into the chamber. Before I could fully react, before my hand could even reach the small, sharp dagger I kept constantly concealed within the folds of my robe for just such an ultimate, desperate necessity, I was seized. Rough, impersonal hands grasped my arms, swiftly disarming me, securing me firmly, but, I noted with detached clarity, without undue violence or intentional humiliation. The gilded cage had sprung shut. I, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, was Octavian's prisoner. My first, and arguably most critical, direct encounter with Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the young man now strategically styling himself Augustus, the revered one, took place shortly thereafter, likely within the captured royal palace. He came, ostensibly to pay respects, but in reality, to inspect his most prized captive, to assert his absolute dominance over the legendary Queen of Egypt, who had defied Rome and captivated two of its greatest leaders. Prepared for this crucial performance, I received him with all the innate regal composure I could summon, refusing to appear as a broken, vanquished supplicant. I arranged myself carefully, perhaps seated on a low couch, dressed simply yet elegantly in mourning linen, projecting an aura of dignified sorrow rather than defeated despair. He entered, flanked by guards, but walking with a distinct, almost unnerving self-possession. Younger than I by several years, his face possessed a cold, smooth, almost marble-like perfection. Handsome, undeniably, but chillingly devoid of the passionate warmth that had animated both Caesar and Antony. His eyes, remarkably pale and piercing, were the most striking feature. Watchful, unnervingly intelligent, utterly unreadable, betraying no flicker of discernible emotion. He moved with a quiet, calculated precision, an absolute self-control that I recognized immediately as profoundly dangerous. Our conversation, conducted formally, likely through interpreters despite my fluency in Latin, maintaining that barrier subtly reinforced my status, was a masterpiece of veiled threats and carefully parried maneuvers, a silent battle waged with nuanced words and watchful eyes. He spoke with perfect icy courtesy of restoring order to troubled Egypt, of his supposed respect for its ancient traditions, a blatant hypocrisy given his clear intent to annex my kingdom, of ensuring the future welfare of the royal children, while pointedly, deliberately, avoiding any specific promises about their status or safety. He inquired, with meticulously feigned concern, after my own health, offering sterile condolences for Antony's demise that ran utterly hollow against the backdrop of his invading legions. I responded with equal calculation, drawing upon every shred of diplomatic skill, honed over a lifetime of perilous negotiation. I spoke of Egypt's immense wealth, its vital strategic importance to Rome, a subtle reminder of the value of a cooperative, living former queen compared to a troublesome dead martyr. I invoked the name of his own adoptive father, the divine Julius Caesar, mentioning Caesarion, testing obliquely for any residual flicker of sentiment, any possible consideration for his brother under Roman law. Could any bond, however thin, be leveraged? But Octavian's mind, I swiftly discerned, was as impenetrable and unyielding as polished granite. He deflected every probe, sidestepped every direct question about my personal fate or that of my children. His calm, almost bland demeanor was a perfect mask, concealing an absolute, unwavering purpose. His intentions were brutally clear. Egypt would be absorbed fully into the Roman Imperium, stripped of its independence, governed directly as his personal domain. Any trace of Antony's rival legacy would be systematically eradicated. And, most crucially for his immediate political needs, Cleopatra, the legendary Serpent of the Nile, the ultimate symbol of the decadent East he had conquered, was destined for Rome. His plan was transparently obvious, terrifyingly simple. I was to be the star attraction, the ultimate trophy in his upcoming triumph, the grand military parade celebrating his victory. I was to be marched in golden chains, perhaps alongside my own children, through the crowded streets of Rome, displayed before the jeering populace as a living monument to his supreme power and the humiliation of his enemies. The very thought sent a jolt of icy dread colder than any asp's venom spiraling through me. The ultimate degradation, to be dragged through the Roman Forum like some captive barbarian chieftainess, stripped of all dignity, subjected to the mob's coarse insults and stares, my children potentially displayed beside me like captured spoils. It was unthinkable, unbearable, impossible. Better death 1,000 times over than such ignominy. As the living embodiment of Isis, as Queen of Egypt descended from conquering kings, my dignity was non-negotiable. My departure from this world, like my reign, had to be an act of sovereign will, not Roman subjugation. Octavian, perhaps sensing the depths of my despair behind my carefully maintained facade, or more likely, simply determined to keep his most valuable prize alive and physically presentable for the degrading spectacle of the triumph, placed me under comfortable but extremely vigilant guard. I was moved from the mausoleum back into secure, opulent chambers within the royal palace complex. My faithful attendants, Charmian and Iris, were permitted to remain with me, a small mercy, but Roman sentries stood perpetually outside my doors, their watchful presence a constant reminder of my captivity. He ensured I was treated with all outward marks of respect. Fine food was provided, fresh linens, even access to scrolls from the library were permitted. But it was undeniably a gilded cage. The elaborate courtesy, a thin veneer over the absolute reality of my imprisonment. He visited me again occasionally, his pale eyes assessing my state of mind, perhaps seeking reassurance that I harbored no immediate plans for self-destruction. I played my part meticulously, feigning a growing resignation, expressing maternal concern for my children's uncertain future, perhaps even hinting vaguely at a reluctant willingness to accept my fate and travel to Rome, all the while secretly solidifying my true, unyielding resolve. I knew Octavian, for all his cold, calculating brilliance, fundamentally misunderstood the Egyptian soul, the fierce pride of the Ptolemies, the divine imperative that flowed through my veins. He saw me as a defeated political entity, a pawn to be strategically deployed in his Roman power games. He could not comprehend that the living Isis would never, ever grace a Roman triumph in chains. During these final tense days of carefully monitored captivity, my thoughts focused with fierce intensity on securing what little I could for my children. I penned letters, pleading eloquently with Octavian to spare Caesarion's life, knowing, perhaps futilely, that as Caesar's acknowledged son, he posed the greatest direct threat to Octavian's carefully constructed narrative of legitimate succession. I appealed to Octavian's sense of magnanimity, a quality I suspected he possessed little of, regarding my younger children by Antony, urging him to show them mercy. Perhaps his sister Octavia, Antony's spurned Roman wife, renowned for her kindness, might intervene on their behalf? I could only pray. I made arrangements through trusted intermediaries who could still, with great risk, slip past the Roman guards, ensuring tutors remained available for the younger children, transferring guardianship arrangements to loyal retainers, and attempting to secrete away portions of my remaining personal jewelry and treasures, hoping some small provision might reach them to ease their uncertain futures in a world suddenly stripped of their royal birthright. Every clandestine action was infused with the mother's fierce, desperate love, a desperate final effort against the crushing weight of political expediency and Roman power. And all the while, as I outwardly complied with Octavian's meticulous arrangements for my departure, appearing calm, perhaps even tragically subdued in my grief, my mind worked with cold, methodical clarity, planning my final, unavoidable act of defiance, my ultimate assertion of sovereignty against the man who believed he had finally conquered me. I carefully observed the changing routines of my guards, noted their moments of complacency or distraction, considered the few means still potentially available to me within my gilded prison. Suicide was not merely an escape from public humiliation. In the sacred traditions of my kingdom, for a ruler like myself, it represented a conscious, controlled transition, a deliberate journey into the realm of the gods, a final, perfect merging with the divine archetype one embodied in life. For me, it was the predestined path back to the eternal embrace of Isis, the sacred journey home from the sorrows of the mortal world. The method, therefore, had to be fitting regal, symbolic, imbued with the ancient magic and mystery of Egypt itself. The bite of the asp, the small sacred serpent of the Nile cobra, depicted for millennia on the pharaonic crowns as a symbol of divine royalty, protective power, and eternal life, presented itself as the most potent, culturally resonant, and spiritually appropriate choice. It promised a relatively swift, perhaps even trance-like passage, consistent with religious belief, and aesthetically preferable to messier alternatives like poison or the dagger, ensuring my body remained outwardly intact, regal even in death, unsuitable for grotesque posthumous display. The sacred serpent of the Nile, the creature of Isis, would deliver my final, defiant message to Rome and to history. Chapter 13. The Asp and the Legacy. The final days unfolded with a quiet, almost serene inevitability, like the slow, majestic drift of a sacred barge towards its final mooring. Octavian, satisfied perhaps by my carefully constructed facade of compliance, or simply distracted by the immense administrative task of absorbing my kingdom into his empire, finalized his plans for departure. The date of his triumph in Rome, featuring me as the unwilling centerpiece, was set. The window for asserting my own ending, my ultimate act of defiance, was rapidly closing. With a silent, intuitive understanding forged over years of shared joys and crises, my unwaveringly loyal attendants, Charmian and Iris women, who had served me faithfully since girlhood, who understood the unspoken language of my heart, helped enact the final, secret preparations. Through carefully cultivated, discreet contacts among the remaining Egyptian palace staff still navigating the Roman presence, a small wicker basket was smuggled into my guarded chambers. It arrived innocuous, concealed beneath a generous layer of fresh, plump figs, a seemingly innocent gift of late summer fruit. But nestled beneath the sweet figs, coiled drowsily in the shadowed bottom of the basket, lay the instrument of my liberation, a small, surprisingly lethargic asp, its intricately patterned scales glistening subtly, almost jewel-like in the dim lamplight. The sacred uraeus, symbol of pharaohs, come not to crown, but to release. On the appointed day, the very day I understood Octavian intended to begin the formal process of transferring me under heavy guard for the humiliating voyage to Rome, I made my final sacred preparations. I bathed ritually, anointing my body with the most fragrant oils, spikenard, frankincense, myrrh scents associated not with mourning, but with divine presence, preparing myself as a bride prepares for her wedding, or a soul prepares for judgment before Osiris. I then donned my most magnificent royal robes, gossamer fine linen embroidered meticulously with gold thread, bearing the potent symbols of Isis, the Tayat knot of life, and the starry heavens. For a final private assertion of my undiminished sovereignty, I placed the heavy double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Pshent, symbolically upon my head, feeling its familiar weight one last time, monarch of my own destiny if no longer of my kingdom. My heart, surprisingly, felt strangely calm, stilled by a profound, almost luminous clarity of purpose. Grief remained, yes, a deep, constant, aching sorrow for my children, for the abrupt, violent end of my dynasty's 3-century rule, for the bitter fate of beloved Egypt now falling fully under the heavy, pragmatic boot of Rome. Caesarion, my brilliant, beautiful son, the living link to Julius, embodiment of a future that might have bridged East and West, I knew with chilling certainty Octavian would never spare him. His very existence was too potent, too dangerous a reminder of an alternative narrative to Rome's supremacy. My Younger Children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, Ptolemy Philadelphus, my sun, my moon, my little brother, lover prince. My heart clenched fiercely at the thought of their uncertain future. I could only offer silent, fervent prayers to Isis, the Great Mother, to watch over them, entrusting them to whatever small seeds of compassion might exist within the cold, calculating heart of Rome, perhaps nurtured by Octavia's renowned decency, raised as Roman nobles, stripped of their royal heritage. The thought was a shard of ice in my soul, yet undeniably better than the swift, politically expedient death that likely awaited Caesarion. But overriding the maternal grief, overriding the sorrow for my kingdom, was a powerful, surging sense of defiant pride and profound spiritual readiness. I would not be paraded. I would not be humiliated. I, Cleopatra VII, Thea Philopator, Queen of Egypt, daughter of the Nile, living Isis, would choose the manner, the moment, and the meaning of my own departure from this mortal realm. My death would be my final political statement, my ultimate assertion of sovereignty over my own being, a testament to the enduring power of Egypt and its ancient gods, even in the face of Roman military conquest. It would deny Octavian his most coveted prize, leaving him with only an empty chariot in his procession, his triumph forever subtly incomplete, haunted perhaps by the phantom echo of the queen who slipped through his grasp into myth. With Charmian and Iris standing faithfully beside me, their familiar faces pale but resolute, their shared presence a final comfort, their loyalty a silent testament to a bond deeper than empire, I carefully reached into the basket of figs. The asp, disturbed by the movement, stirred sluggishly, raising its small, wedge-shaped head. Taking a slow, steadying breath, steeling my resolve not against fear, but against the lingering tendrils of worldly attachment, I calmly took the serpent into my hand. Its skin felt surprisingly cool, dry, ancient. With deliberate purpose, I held it firmly against my breast, close to my heart. There was a brief, sharp sting, less painful than I might have imagined, almost insignificant, like a pinprick. Then, almost immediately, a curious, spreading numbness began, a strange, languid warmth radiating outwards, followed by a profound, inexorable drowsiness, descending upon me like a heavy, luxurious cloak woven from shadows. I allowed myself to recline back upon the cushioned couch, arranging my limbs with conscious dignity, ensuring my posture remained regal even as dissolution began its gentle work. Charmian, tears streaming silently down her cheeks but her hands steady, adjusted my royal diadem one last time. Iris carefully smoothed the intricate golden folds of my robe. Through rapidly dimming eyes, clouded now as if by mist rolling in from the Nile, I saw their beloved faces looking down at me, filled with boundless love, sorrow, and unwavering loyalty. "Is this well done?" Charmian whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief, gently adjusting a stray lock of my dark hair. "It is well done," I managed to reply, my own voice already a faint echo, seeming to come from a great distance, and fitting for a queen, descended from so many kings. Those were, I believe, my final mortal words whispered into the suddenly quiet chamber. The tangible world began to recede, its sharp edges softening, dissolving. The muffled sounds of the palace outside, the distant shouts of Roman soldiers securing their positions, the faint, urban hum of my captured Alexandria faded into an immense, profound silence, like falling snow blanketing the earth. The light in the chamber seemed to coalesce, then dimmed, dissolving into gentle, welcoming shadows. The physical sensations, the warmth, the numbness, vanished, replaced by a profound sense of lightness, of release, of peacefully drifting on the cool, dark, gentle current of a sacred river, flowing inexorably, serenely, towards a vast, luminous, welcoming sea. My consciousness, my ba, detached itself effortlessly from the failing vessel of my body, floating free, ethereal, suddenly unburdened by the immense weight of queenship, of love, of loss. I felt not an ending, but a transformation, a sacred merging, a destined return. The serpent of the Nile was shedding its mortal skin at last, preparing to rejoin the eternal, shimmering essence of Isis, the great mother goddess, the source from which all life flowed, and to which all existence must ultimately, gratefully return. My turbulent reign on earth was over. My true journey into the luminous heart of the divine mystery was just beginning. Epilogue. Echoes on the Nile. So the mortal coil unwound, the asp delivered its cold kiss, and I, Cleopatra, Pharaoh of Egypt, passed beyond the reach of Octavian and the grasp of Rome. Here in the field of reeds, where Osiris reigns eternally, the weight of the double crown is lifted, the burdens of rule dissolved. The struggles, the triumphs, the heartbreaks of earthly existence ripple outward on the waters of memory, finding their place in the vast ocean of what was. My final act, they say, cheated Octavian of his crowning glory. He conquered my kingdom, seized my treasury, paraded my younger children through Rome trophies of his victory. But he could not parade me. My refusal to adorn his triumph, my choice of a royal death befitting Isis, became my last victory, a final assertion of will that resonated even through Roman chronicles, however grudgingly. Egypt, my beloved Egypt, became a jewel in Rome's imperial crown, governed by prefects, its immense wealth fueling Roman coffers for centuries. The pharaoh still guided ships into the harbor for a time. The Mosian's scholarly traditions flickered, but the independent flame of Ptolemaic rule, the flame I fought so desperately to keep alive, was extinguished. Yet the spirit of Kemet, ancient and profound, endured beneath the Roman veneer, its gods and mysteries continuing to whisper along the Nile long after the legions marched. My children. Ah, that remains the sharpest echo in this timeless realm. Caesarion, my brilliant son, hope of two worlds, was executed swiftly. Octavian could tolerate no rival claimant sired by the divine Julius. My precious twins, Helios and Selene, and little Philadelphus, were spared death but condemned perhaps to a gilded cage, raised in Rome by the virtuous Octavia, Antony's spurned wife. A strange mercy to be brought up by the wife of the man their father left for their mother. Selene, the moon princess, shone briefly, marrying Juba of Mauritania, carrying our blood westward. Of Helios and Philadelphus, the sun prince and the brother lover, history falls silent. Did they live quiet lives as Roman nobles? Did they dream of the Alexandrian sun? Their fates remain lost whispers, a mother's eternal sorrow. My own legacy? It became a battleground, much like my life. Roman historians, seeking to legitimize Augustus and vilify his enemies, crafted the image of the treacherous foreign seductress, the decadent oriental threat to Roman virtue. For centuries, that image held sway, repeated, embellished. Yet, something of my true spirit, my intellect, my political acumen, my defiance, perhaps the sheer force of my personality, refused to be entirely buried under their propaganda. Through Plutarch, through faint echoes in other texts, later ages sensed the complexity. Shakespeare saw the towering passion, Shaw the shrewd politician, artists the captivating beauty, poets the tragic grandeur. I became a symbol, mutable, reflecting the desires and fears of each era that conjured me. Was I merely ambitious? Yes, profoundly so for my dynasty, for my country, for the Hellenistic world I hoped to unite under our rule. Was I ruthless? When necessity demanded, yes, the throne tolerates no weakness. Did I use love as a tool? Perhaps, but did I not also love deeply, truly, tragically? Caesar offered a meeting of minds and empires. Antony, a tempestuous mirroring of souls. These were not mere calculations, whatever Rome's scribblers claimed. They were the grand passions that shape history. Here, where the scales of Maat balance all deeds, I see my life not as failure, but as a brilliant flame that burned fiercely against an overwhelming tide. I reigned for 22 years, held Rome at bay, expanded Egypt's borders, bore heirs to two of the most powerful men on earth, and lived and died as a pharaoh, true to the legacy of Alexander and the divinity of Isis. Few women, few rulers could claim as much. Let the Nile flow on. Let empires rise and fall like the relentless turning of the stars I once charted. Let memory distort and legend embellish. The essence endures. I was Cleopatra, queen of kings, last pharaoh of Egypt, and in my story perhaps, generations yet unborn will hear the echo of a timeless truth, that even when facing the impossible, the human spirit can choose defiance, choose dignity, choose to shape its own end, leaving behind not just ruins, but a light that continues to fascinate, to inspire, and perhaps to warn. My reign has ended, but the echoes of my name on the banks of the Nile and across the world persist.